my name is Tanya Johnson. I am the co-founder of the Institute of Child Psychology. We are thrilled to welcome Dr. Gabor Maté. Welcome, Dr. Gabor.
Thank you. It's nice to be with you.
Dr. Gabor, we only have you for a short amount of time today. I think the first thing that I'd love to ask you about is, in your documentary, The Wisdom of Trauma, you say that trauma is not what happens to you, but rather what happens inside of you as a reaction to the trauma itself. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit to this today.
Sure. So that really comes from a very root of the word trauma, which is a Greek word for wound. So wound is not what happens to you. A wound is what you sustain in your body or in your soul. So trauma is a wounding. So there's the external event, which is the abuse or the death of your parent or tsunami or war. Those are the external events. They're the traumatic events. But the trauma, the wound, is what happens to you internally. So trauma is a psychic wound that we sustain, usually in childhood. And I need to add to that there's two ways that you can hurt children. One is by doing something to them that should never happen, such as abuse. But the other is just by denying their needs. That's another way to hurt people. And so a lot of the wounding that happens in the world, and certainly in Western society, is not just the bad things that happen to kids, and often they do, but also because children's needs aren't being met and they suffer as a result. So for me, trauma encompasses both those trajectories.
Gabor, how are our children's needs not currently being met by the world that we live in?
So if we look at how human beings evolved, we've evolved in environments that suited our needs because we evolved in response to those environments. And so for most of human existence, human beings lived, I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of years, human beings lived in small hunter-gatherer bands where children were always with the parents. They were not put down to cry. They were held all the time. They were carried with the parents everywhere the parents went. Children were generally not hit, according to all the research in these Aboriginal groupings. They were parented by multiple adults. So they had lots of caregivers that they connect with. They played freely out in nature with age mates, with playmates of multiple ages. So these are the developmental needs of children. They're in our society. Often kids don't see their parents the whole day. They don't have a large group of nurturing adult attachments. And a lot of the parenting advice that people get is how to punish children when they don't behave the way we want them to. These unmet needs and these parenting practices are actually hurtful to children. Take for example, the simple technique that a lot of people advocate of timeout. A 2-year-old throws a tantrum, which is what 2-year-olds do, by the way. The parent is told, time out, separate from the child. Let the child know in harsh terms that you're not going to be with them if they behave in that way. What does the child, what message does the child get? Is that who they are is not acceptable to the parent. Well, that's a deep wound. And the child is only being their natural selves. So I'm not saying that children don't need to learn discipline, but that's not how you teach discipline. So just by disciplining methods, we're hurting kids. We're hurting babies when doctors tell parents to let the kids sleep it out so they can go back to sleep. The child's cry is a demand to be picked up, to be held. Deny that need, that child is hurt. So it's that simple, really.
Connection,
yeah. Deny connection, there's a wound.
Got it.
And imagine for us adults, like as adults, we're much more capable and self-sustaining. But what happens to us when our needs for connection are denied? Well, imagine what happens to a 1-day-old or a 6-month-old or a 1-year-old.
It amazes me how contrary it all is to current prevailing advice that our parents are given.
And the problem is that in modern culture, we've become far denatured, separated from our own gut feelings. Because I happen to know that a lot of parents I've talked to, when they do let the child cry it out, their own hearts are crying, but they're following doctor's advice. Well, if they're connected to their gut feelings, they would not follow that kind of advice. So it's not that parents don't love their kids, it's that they themselves have been separated from their own gut feelings.
Gabor, it just makes me think about how far we've come from where we naturally should be with our children, with the people that we love.
Yeah. And we see the impact in all the children being diagnosed with ADHD or oppositional defiant disorder or reactive attachment disorder or anxiety or depression, any number of behavioral problems. And we think there's something wrong with the kids. No, these kids are reacting to basically to their needs not being met. And they develop various coping mechanisms that we then label as diseases or behavior problems. And rather than looking at the fundamental issue, we try and diagnose and fix the kid, thereby doing further harm.
I think sometimes it's so much harder to look at ourselves as parents or as adults and say, perhaps this is something that I need to look at within instead of looking at the child.
Well, look, as a parent myself, I just wish I'd been aware of what I'm aware of now when my kids were small. So I began to look at myself, and retrospectively, I completely see how I lived my life and how I parented them, came out of my own unconscious, unresolved issues, and how I passed it on to my kids. Not because I didn't love them, not because I wouldn't have thrown myself into a fire for them, but because I just didn't know any better.
Gabor, I think that that's what is so important about your message and your work, is that I think when we help parents to know better, we can do better.
Well, we can do better, and in our hearts, we want to do better. And it's not a question of loving our kids more. It's a question of seeing them more clearly and recognizing their needs more clearly. And that, for that, we need help these days.
We do. Yeah, it's not as instinctual as it used to be.
No, you still have the instincts, but the environment doesn't evoke those instincts. See, instincts have to be evoked by the environment, whether in an animal or a human being. So we have the parenting instincts, we're born with them, but they need to be developed and they need to be evoked. And in today's environment, they're often suppressed rather than evoked.
Gabor, I feel like I could probably keep you here for another 4 hours with me. So many questions, but I know that you will be joining us on November 20th to talk about the biology of loss. Thank you so much for your time today. Your work is so incredibly important.
Well, I couldn't be more delighted to be invited to speak to you, and so nice to meet you as well personally.
Thank you, Gabor.
Thank you. Bye-bye.